Eve Wilkowitz was a 20-year-old woman who was born and raised in Oakdale, Suffolk County in New York. Eve had a younger sister, Irene Wilkowitz, whom she was very close with. Her family and friends described her as a vibrant, loving, and charming woman. In 1976, her mother passed away from breast cancer, which affected her and her sisters deeply. In 1980, Eve moved to Bayshore, New York in order to be closer to her job. She worked as a secretary at Macmillan Publishing in Manhattan, New York City. In February 1980, she met Jack Dempsey, who was an aspiring writer. They would soon start dating. On the evening of March 21, 1980, Eve went out to watch a movie with Jack. They returned to Jack's apartment. Sometime before midnight, Eve was extremely tired, so she decided to take a quick nap and asked her boyfriend to wake her up in time to catch the last Long Island Railroad train home. Her boyfriend asked her to stay the night, but even insisted that she needed to go back to her apartment as she needed to take care of some personal work. The next day, Jack woke her up and dropped her off at Penn Station in Manhattan. Eve took the last railroad chain back to her home in Bayshore. However, she never made it back to her home. 3 days later, on March 25, 1980, a woman discovered Eve's body near the train station in Bayshore. An autopsy revealed that she had been bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death with a rope. Police believe that she had been held captive for 3 days before she was killed. Her body had been dumped in the backyard of a house not far from her own home. Her shoes, pocketbook, and coat were missing. The police interviewed family and friends. Her boyfriend was suspected but was quickly ruled out. Police questioned people around the crime scene, but no one had noticed anything suspicious. Police were able to collect DNA samples from the crime scene, and over the years, the DNA was uploaded to various DNA databases, but no matches could be found. With no leads and no suspects, the case would eventually go cold. For years, Eve's younger sister, Irene Wilkowitz, had become the last advocate for Eve. After her father died in 2010, Irene would regularly contact the detectives, hoping to keep the case alive and trying to find any updates. Then in 2018, Irene's son learned about the new investigative technique, genetic genealogy, used to catch the Golden State Killer. However, as the technique used private genealogy databases in order to find familial connections to identify the suspect, the technique had raised concerns for many due to the misuse of people's personal data. As a result, some states did not allow it to use. In January of 2019, Irene contacted police and asked them to use the technique in her sister's case, but was told that New York did not allow the use of this technique. But investigators were able to find a workaround. The FBI had investigated the case in 1980 and were under no such restrictions. The detective sent the DNA from the semen sample collected from the crime scene to the FBI, and in July of 2021, with the help of genetic genealogy, they were able to find a distant relative. Soon they narrowed it down to one suspect, Herbert Rice. However, they cannot question him as he had already died. He died in 1991 from cancer. Detectives then tracked down his son, who voluntarily gave a DNA sample. Detective soon confirmed that Herbert Rice had been the killer. At the time of the murder, Herbert had lived close to the crime scene. His ex-wife told detectives that at the time of the murder, she had kicked Rice out of their marital home, and he had been living at his mother's house, which was a few houses away from the crime scene. At the time, Rice had 3 prior convictions for minor crimes, which did not require him to provide a DNA sample to be entered into the database. In March of 2022, investigators exhumed Rice's body and took a DNA sample, which was conclusively confirmed to be a match to the semen taken from the crime scene. 42 years prior, the case was solved after almost half a century. Lisa Fracassi was a 37-year-old woman living at Waikiki apartment along 415 Nalua Street, Honolulu, Hawaii. In 1994, she was working as an exotic dancer at a club called Exotic Paradise in order to save money for nursing school so that she could become a nurse. On October 30th, 1994, Lisa went to work and returned home at around 2 a.m. on October 31st. This would be the last time she was seen alive. Lisa was supposed to work on November 2nd, but she never showed up. Her boss called her apartment, but nobody answered. Then on November 3rd, 1994, a maid who worked at the service department went inside her room to deliver fresh towels. She knocked on the door, but nobody answered, so she decided to enter the room. There had been a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the front door, but it had been there since October 31st. Upon entering the room, the maid discovered the body of Lisa. She had been strangled to death with the phone cord. Her mouth had been stuffed with a bed sheet. Police discovered a cigarette butt and a condom in her room. The coroner determined that she had been dead for at least 3 days. It is believed that Lisa was killed on October 31st, Halloween. There was no sign of forced entry into her apartment. Police interviewed neighbors and friends, but no one reported anything suspicious. Her ex-boyfriend, whom Lisa had broken up with a few weeks prior, was considered a suspect, but he was quickly cleared. The police had no suspects or clues, and the case would eventually go cold. The police did find DNA evidence at the crime scene, which was preserved in hopes that advancements in DNA technology could help them find the killer. In 2020, the Honolulu Police Department reopened the case and sent the DNA sample from the condom and the fingerprint from the cigarette butt to Parabon Nanolabs. Using genetic genealogy, genealogist Cease Moore was able to find a potential relative of the suspect, and in 2022, she identified Cecil Trent as a potential suspect. Trent, however, had died in 2013 from congestive heart failure at the age of 48. Police then matched the fingerprints found at the crime scene to the fingerprint record taken from Cecil Trent after his death, and it was a perfect match. Trent was 29 years old at the time of the murder and was never considered a suspect in the case. Even though Trent was not able to be charged, the case was considered solved after 28 years. Marise Ann Chiverella was a 9-year-old girl living with her parents in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. On March 18, 1964, Marissa left her home alone for her school. At around 8 p.m., she was a 3rd grader at the St. Joseph's parochial school, and the school was only 10 minutes walk from her home. She used to go with her siblings, but on this day she had decided to go alone, as she wanted to get to school early. She wanted to deliver cans of beers and beads to her teacher for her teacher's feast day. However, she never made it. She was last seen alive at around 8:10 a.m. walking east on West 4th Street. At around 1 p.m. on the same day, a man was giving his 16-year-old nephew driving lessons near an abandoned strip mine when he noticed what appeared to be a large doll on top of a garbage pile. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a body of a small girl. He immediately notified police. The body was later confirmed to be Marise Ann Chiverella. Her body had been found 2 miles away from her home. Her hands and feet had been tied with her own shoelaces. An autopsy revealed she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Her clothes and the canned foods were found at the crime scene. Police questioned family and friends. They also interviewed a priest who had been suspected in a murder of another girl. in Bristol, Pennsylvania, and a local exhibitionist who committed suicide shortly after he was asked to give a polygraph test. Police interviewed numerous suspects over the years, but none were ever charged. The case would eventually go cold. In 2007, a sample found at the crime scene was submitted to the Pennsylvania State Laboratory, and a suspect's DNA profile was made. The DNA profile was entered into CODAs, but no matches could be found. In 2018, with the help of Paraborn Nanolabs, a forensic sketch of the potential suspect was made. Using the DNA found at the crime scene, the photo showed how the suspect may have looked like at the age of 25, 40, and 60. The police released the photos to the general public, hoping to find any leads, but to no will. Then in 2019, the DNA sample was entered into genealogy databases and found a match to a very distant relative of the suspect. However, the investigators had no idea about the suspect identity. Then in 2020, genealogist Eric Schubert, an 18-year-old college student, reached out to the police and offered his help. Free of charge, Eric had a special set of skills of drawing and tracing family trees to find matches. He had previously helped the police in several cases. The police agreed, and Eric got to work. The next few months, Eric worked tirelessly and provided names of relatives who were scattered throughout the country. The police collected DNA from the relatives and, mastered with the DNA, founded the crime scene. Soon they zeroed in on a local bartender named James. However, they found out the food had died in 1980. In January 2nd, 2022, his body was exhumed and a DNA sample was taken. On February 3rd, 2022, a DNA test confirmed his DNA flashed to the DNA found at the crime scene. At the time of the murder, Forge was 22 years old and lived 6 to 7 blocks away from Marissa. Fort worked as a bartender and bar supply salesman. In his Elton, he was never married and had no children. Ford was arrested for sexual assault in an unrelated crime in 1974, 10 years after Marissa's murder. However, he was given a plea bargain for aggravated assault and sentenced to 1 year on probation. 4 years later, he was again arrested and charged with reckless endangering another person and harassment. Police say they have no further details about this arrest. Ford died in 1980 of natural causes, possibly a heart attack in the bar he worked. Marissa's siblings thanked investigators and a rec for solving the case and bringing some form of closure to the family. Wazir Pasha was a 35-year-old man living with his wife in Guana Nanagara, Bengaluru, India. In early May 2nd, 2015, Pasha's wife reported him missing after he failed to return home after work. On May 16, 2015, a body would be found in Samandapelli, Anantapur on the Pradesh. Police were unable to identify him, as there was no identification on him. With little to no leads, both cases remained unsolved for next few years. Then in 2022, Deputy Commissioner of Police came across the missing person case of Wazir Pasha and ordered a fresh probe into the case. The police questioned friends and relatives. They also decided to go through Pasha's phone records and found that the last call Pasha had received was from one of his distant relatives. Hina Kosher police decided to question her However, they soon learned that Hina and her husband, Mohammed Ghosh, had also not been seen since 2015. The police tried to locate them, but there was no trace of them. Finding it suspicious, the police decided to put the couple's family under surveillance. On February 11th, 2022, Hina's grandfather died. Police went to the house in civilian clothes, hoping the couple would show up for the funeral. Fortunately, Hina and Ghosh showed up and were immediately detained for questioning. During the interview, the couple admitted to murdering Pasha. They told police the couple had gotten married in 2012 and moved to Bengaluru. They had been working as a dealer. At their house, they stitched clothes and supplied clothes to the garment factories, but the business did not do well, and they had incurred heavy losses. The couple took a loan from a Mallory, but were unable to pay it back, so they decided to move to Hyderabad. However, the mall, we found out about their location and demanded they pay him back the money. The couple then returned back to Bengaluru. Wazir Pasha reportedly decided to help the couple, but in exchange he wanted to sleep with Hina. Hina initially refused, but with the mounting debt on their heads, she eventually agreed. She later told her husband, who got extremely angry and decided to kill Pasha. The couple devised a plan to murder him. On May 13, 2015, Hina called Pasha over when Pasha entered Hina's house. Ghosts came out of fighting, and the couple strangled Pasha with Hina. They then dismembered his body and put it into sacks filled with clothes. They then dumped his body in a drainage near Samandapalli, Anantapur. The couple then moved to Anantapur the same day. Please realize, the unidentified body found in Samandapalli could be Pasha. They send the DNA samples collected from the unidentified body, along with the DNA from Pasha's relatives for testing. A DNA test confirmed that the body was indeed of Wazir Pasha. The case was solved after 7 years. On June 3, 1993, a truck driver discovered a body of a woman on westbound Pacheco bus highway in Gilroy, California. After he had stopped to relieve himself, he immediately notified police. A coroner reported her cause of death as undetermined. At the time, the woman was wearing blue clothing and had no identification on her. Police tried everything to identify her, but with no luck. The police referred to her as Blue Pacheco, and she was buried in a local cemetery. A year later, a newspaper in Oregon started receiving letters confessing to murdering 5 people throughout West Coast. The newspaper ran a 5-part series with the name Happy Face Serial Killer as the letter writer signed the letter with a smiley face. At the time, there were 4 or 5 unsolved murders in the area. A year later, Keith Hunter Jasperson was identified as the letter writer. He confessed to murdering several people. However, authorities linked him to 8 female murders between 1990 and 1995. He also wrote a letter to the Santa Clara County District Attorney in 2006 admitting to sexually assaulting and killing a female on Pacheco Bus Highway. However, he said that he did not know the woman's identity. In 2007, Jasperson pleaded guilty to killing the unknown woman, later referred to as Blue Pacheco. He told police he met the woman at a truck stop on Interstate 5 in Corning, California, and gave her a ride. He said he had sex with her before strangling her to death. He then drove towards Gilroy and dumped her body at the Pacheco bus on Highway 152. He told police She had told him she had family in Sacramento, California. However, he did not know her name. Just person was sentenced to life in prison for multiple homicides, with no possibility of a parole. Even though the woman's killer was behind bars, police had no idea about the victim's identity. In 2019, police reopened the case and conducted DNA Due Project for the help in identifying the victim. The DNA Due Project used genetic genealogy to create a DNA profile of the victim and entered it into the GED match. On April 13, 2022, detectives identified Blue Pacheco as Patricia Sheppel, known to her family as Patsy. Patricia was a mother and a longtime resident of Colton, Oregon. Patricia was 45 years old at the time of her death. No other information has been released to the public. The case was sold after 29 years